Hey everybody, we are back with Dracena Wines Live, and we're gonna go a little bit more in depth today. I hope that it's not too geeky, but you just can't get the geek out of somebody, okay? The science geekiness is there. So what we're gonna talk about today is the science of fermentation. So I'm excited because you know what? We love wine, and you can't have wine without fermentation. So we're just going to go into a little bit about what makes fermentation happen, those little buggers about, how they live, what they like, what they don't like, because they are very specific. And part of being specific is that stuck fermentation thing, okay, that we don't ever really want, okay, unless you're set at home and trying to make a sweet white Zinfandel. But this is what we're going to talk about today, is the science of fermentation. So fermentation is what makes the difference between drinking grape juice and wine, right? It's really a rather simple concept, and it has been occurring in nature as long as there has been grapes on a vine, okay? Humans didn't invent fermentation. They simply stumbled upon it, right? They just stumbled. And what they did was they realized it was a wonderful result. So wine is fermented grape juice, right? But we have other types. Mead is fermented honey, and perry, ever hear of that? Perry is fermented pear. So ever wonder why grapes ferment so easily? The truth is that it's really the perfect vessel for yeast. They have relatively high sugar and the content compared to other fruit. So like apples, as an example, right? They contain 5 to 8% sugar, while grapes contain 24 to 25%. So obviously the yeasts are going to be happy, right? So they are also higher in nitrogen, as well as many other nutrients that are required by the yeast. So the yeast are pretty happy on the grapes. So grapes also contain biotin, which the yeast cannot produce themselves. So it's a bonus. Their pH levels, okay, is 3 to 4, is too acidic for many organisms, but it's kind of good for the yeast. So there's no competition. So as I mentioned previously, okay, fermentation has been occurring naturally. Since 4000 BC was when humans first found it, okay? But they didn't understand it. And it wasn't until my buddy, my hero, Louis Pasteur, discovered him under the microscope. So he was asked by the wine industry to figure out why vinegar was being made instead of their precious wine, okay? So the wine industry, to figure out why vinegar was being made instead of their precious wine. And his discovery has led to the understanding of cleaning barrels and or tanks, and proved that fermentation is an anaerobic. Do we know what anaerobic means? It means without oxygen. So in order to prove his theory, he created his famous swan neck experiment. So I think I have a picture. I do not have a picture, but we can talk about these little guys. Okay, so his discovery led to the understanding of cleaning barrels and tanks and how important that is, right? And that the doing it without the oxygen. So in order to prove his theory, he created this experiment, and it was kind of cool. He had these flasks and these big long necks, and what happens is he was learning that as the microorganisms went into an open neck, they grew and grew, and they loved life. But what he did was he took another one, and he took that flask neck and he bent it, and when he bent it, the microorganisms could go in here, but then they couldn't go back up and then back into it. So he discovered microorganisms. And by that understanding, we learned that, all right, we have to stop these guys from going in here and destroying our wine, okay? So one of the rules in nature, as we all know from Darwin, is survival of the fittest. And yeast cannot ignore this rule either. So just as humans need sustenance, okay, so do the yeast. So this is where the grapes come in. Okay, the yeast are what many winemakers use in the winemaking process. Okay, but there's other things we can do, and there's some controversy to native. Right, so we hear all the time native yeast. Okay, well, it's really not. It's not, or house yeast, right? These yeast are on the grapes already, and it's a house yeast because everybody in the winery, right, the yeast that are in there, that's kind of where it is. So it's not really native, right? It's that house yeast, what's happening in there, and it is survival of the fittest, okay? So instead of the yeast, right, as the alcohol, we know that the yeast come in, they start eating the sugars, and as the sugars go away, we get the yeast byproducts. So it's actually like the poop of the yeast, okay? So let's see if I can get this up here. So this is, oh no, you can't see that wonderful formula. This is cellular respiration. So this is what every organism goes through if they're going to live. If they have oxygen, okay? So what's behind my picture, which you can't see, is the oxygen. And then what's below is 38 ATP, okay? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Sorry to be geeky, but that's energy. Think of it as all little micro molecules or Bitcoin that let you go, 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 go. So when there's oxygen, right, this is where we make 38 ATPs and all is good. But the problem is that we don't have oxygen in the wine making process because we know that the oxygen in the wine making process doesn't do a good job, right? So what we do is we go through alcoholic fermentation. And my picture is in the wrong place, but what that does is no oxygen, and that 2 that you can see is 2 ATP. So in alcoholic respiration, we only get 2 ATPs, and that is how the yeast survive, on just those 2 ATP. And those that non-aerobic allows the yeast that we want to survive and the yeast that we don't want to survive to die off, okay? So alcohol gets converted, the sugar gets converted into alcohol. We know that carbon dioxide is released and the yeast get their little oxygen. But they are super specific, and that's where the pH comes in. So as the pH changes, different organisms can live in there. And as you can see, wine is way down to like 3 to 4. If we have wine that comes into the higher pHs, then bad organisms get in there, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, so it's very specific that we keep within the proper pH to allow the bacteria to go through that alcoholic fermentation and keep the bad bacteria out. Now here's a little fun fact. Do you know that we actually go through cellular respiration also? Or I guess technically alcoholic respiration is what I meant to say. We do. And what happens, instead of producing the alcohol, we produce lactic acid. Okay, so instead of being alcoholic fermentation, we call it lactic acid fermentation. And that's that like post-workout, what they call DOMS, that post-workout pain. You're like, yeah, I worked out hard. That's lactic acid fermentation. Follows exactly the same thing that our lovely yeasties do to give us alcohol. And let me get out of here. Nope, having difficulty. Stop share. Okay, so that's basically fermentation, right? So the yeast come in, they go through anaerobic fermentation, so they're only making those 2 ATPs, okay? But in the process, they are blowing off the carbon dioxide, they're blowing off the alcohol, and that is their waste product. And because of their waste product, we get the benefit of alcohol. So there you have it. two types of fermentation. Both can occur during the winemaking process, although we really want the alcohol fermentation. We don't want the cellular respiration to go on. Okay, we want the little bit of oxygen. So you might have heard of micro-oxidation. That's good. But too much oxygen makes the wine go bad, allows other microorganisms to come in and live and take over that survival of the fittest. So I hope you enjoyed my little brief fermentation story. I could go on and on about the science of wine, but I hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful Tuesday. Sláinte.